They told her the West was a land of second chances, but as Clara Penrose stepped off the train, she realized some things follow you across a continent. In an age where a woman's worth was measured by the strength of her hands and the bloom on her cheeks, Clara was a broken ledger. Shamed in the East and rejected the moment she touched Wyoming soil, she became the bride no one wanted, the woman the frontier forgot. Until a man with mountain dust in his beard leaned close and whispered 5 words that changed her destiny. This is a story of scars, snow, and the kind of love that only grows in the shadows.
Welcome back to Rescued by the Ridge. If you find peace in these stories of the high country and the resilient spirits of the Old West, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Join our community of travelers as we journey back to a time of true grit and quiet redemption.
The train whistle screamed one last time, cutting through the heavy silence of the Wyoming plains. For Clara Penrose, that sound was the final chord being cut from her old life. She stood on the iron steps of the Union Pacific car, her heart drumming against her ribs like a trapped bird. In the late 1800s, a woman traveled west for 2 reasons, a desperate hope or a deep secret. Clara carried both. She clutched the handle of her battered trunk, her right hand hidden deep within the folds of her woolen shawl. That hand, scarred by the clicking gears of a Massachusetts textile loom, was the reason she was here. Back east, she was damaged goods, a girl who could no longer work the machines. Here, she hoped to be a wife. The platform at Bitter Creek was nothing more than sun-bleached planks and a layer of fine red dust. A small crowd had gathered. In those days, the arrival of a mail-order bride was more than a wedding. It was a community event. People came to see the new blood arriving to tame the wild. Then she saw him, Mr. Arthur Henderson. He was exactly as his letters had described, tall, wearing a clean vest, and looking every bit the successful town businessman. He held a small bouquet of wilted wildflowers. Clara stepped onto the planks, her boots clicking softly. She tried to smile, but her face felt stiff from the weeks of soot-filled air and the dry prairie wind. Arthur approached her with a wide grin, but as Clara reached out to steady herself against the railing, her shawl slipped. The scarred, twisted skin of her hand was revealed in the harsh, unforgiving midday sun. The grin on Arthur's face didn't just fade, it vanished. He stopped 3 feet away. His eyes flicked from her hand to her face, then back to the hand. The silence on the platform grew heavy. The townspeople began to whisper, their eyes turning into needles. "You didn't mention this in the letters," Arthur said. His voice wasn't angry, it was cold. To him, a contract was a contract, and he felt cheated. He didn't offer her his arm. He didn't take her trunk. Without another word, Arthur Henderson turned on his heel and walked toward his buggy, leaving the flowers in the dirt. Clara stood frozen as the train began to chuff, its wheels spinning to leave her behind. She was thousands of miles from home, with no money, no husband, and the station master already reaching for the closed sign.
The sound of the steam engine faded into a low hum, then into nothing at all. The great iron beast was gone, taking with it the last connection to the world Clara knew. Dust settled on her dark traveling dress, turning the fabric a dull, ghostly gray. She stood alone on that platform, a single woman in a territory that didn't know what to do with a person who didn't serve a purpose. In the 1880s, the frontier was a place of utility. Every person, every tool, and every animal was expected to earn its keep. For a woman arriving as a bride, her utility was often judged by her ability to cook, sew, and raise a family. By turning his back, Arthur Henderson hadn't just rejected a romance, he had publicly declared Clara unfit for the rigors of Wyoming life. Clara reached down and grabbed the iron handle of her trunk. She pulled, but the heavy chest barely budged. Her right hand, stiff and weak, throbbed with the effort. She wouldn't ask for help. She couldn't. Instead, she used her shoulder, inching the trunk toward the only open door in sight, the general store and post office. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of brine, kerosene, and dried tobacco. This was the heart of a trail town. In those days, the general store was more than a shop. It was the lifeblood of the community. Rows of canned goods, heavy bolts of denim, and barrels of salt pork lined the walls. It was a place where news was traded like currency. As Clara stepped inside, the low chatter of two men by the stove stopped abruptly. They didn't look away. They stared. In a small town like Bitter Creek, news traveled faster than a prairie fire. They already knew. She was the damaged bride from the 3 o'clock train. Clara reached down and grabbed the iron handle of her trunk. She pulled, but the heavy chest barely budged. Her right hand, stiff and weak, throbbed with the effort. She wouldn't ask for help. She couldn't. Instead, she used her shoulder, inching the trunk toward the only open door in sight, the general store and post office. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of brine, kerosene, and dried tobacco. This was the heart of a trail town. In those days, the general store was more than a shop. It was the lifeblood of the community. Rows of canned goods, heavy bolts of denim, and barrels of salt pork lined the walls. It was a place where news was traded like currency. As Clara stepped inside, the low chatter of two men by the stove stopped abruptly. They didn't look away. They stared. In a small town like Bitter Creek, news traveled faster than a prairie fire. They already knew. She was the damaged bride from the 3 o'clock train. Clara found a small wooden bench near the back and sat. She opened her reticule and counted her coins. 12 cents. A ticket back to the east cost nearly $40. She was trapped. She watched the storekeeper organize a shelf of medicinal tonics, his movements slow and deliberate. To him, she was just another ghost passing through. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the floorboards. The temperature in the high plains drops fast once the sun vanishes, a hard lesson many newcomers learned too late. Clara shivered, tucking her hands into her sleeves. She felt like an item of lost luggage that no one intended to claim. Suddenly, the heavy front door creaked open. A draft of cold mountain air rushed in, fluttering the labels on the dry goods. A man stepped inside, his presence filling the small room. He didn't look like the townspeople. He looked like the earth itself, rugged, unpolished, and silent. He walked straight to the counter, but as he passed Clara, he stopped. He didn't stare at her hand. He didn't whisper to his neighbor. He simply stood there, a shadow in the dim light, looking at the woman the rest of the world had already written off. The man standing in the doorway didn't look like the gentleman Clara had seen in the East. He didn't wear a polished vest or a silk cravat. He wore a heavy canvas coat, stained by the sap of 1,000 pines, and boots that had walked paths no wagon could follow. This was Gideon Hayes. In the 1880s, men like Gideon were the backbone of the high country, loggers, trappers, and ranchers who lived where the air was thin and the winters were long. Gideon moved with a quiet deliberateness. He didn't smell like the bay rum and expensive cigars of the town men. He smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and the sharp, clean scent of the high-altitude wilderness. He stepped toward the counter, his spurs jingling softly against the floorboards. "Late for you to be down from the ridge, Gideon," the storekeeper muttered, not looking up from his ledger. "The salt gave out," Gideon replied. His voice was deep, like the sound of stones grinding together in a riverbed. It wasn't loud,
but it filled the room. Gideon didn't look at the storekeeper. His eyes were fixed on Clara. She felt her face heat up under his steady gaze. Out of habit, she tucked her right hand deeper into her sleeve, pressing the scarred skin against her side. She expected him to laugh. She expected him to ask why a broken woman was sitting alone in a general store at twilight. In those days, life on a mountain homestead was a test of endurance. A man alone struggled to keep a hearth fire going while tending to the livestock. A woman alone had almost no path to survival. Marriage was often less about romance and more about a mutual pact to stay alive against the elements. Gideon took 2 slow steps toward her. He didn't stop until he was standing just a few feet away. He looked at her battered trunk, then at the tears she was trying so hard to hide. He saw the way she shielded her hand, but his expression didn't change. There was no pity in his eyes, only a strange, quiet understanding. He removed his hat, revealing hair the color of sun-scorched grass. He leaned in just enough so the storekeeper wouldn't hear. "I heard what happened on the platform," Gideon said softly. "Arthur Henderson is a man who looks at the surface of things. He's looking for a painting to hang on his wall." Clara looked up, her breath catching. Gideon's eyes were the color of a winter lake, cool but deep. "The ridge is a hard place," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the stove. "It doesn't care about beauty, it cares about heart. I have a cabin that's too quiet and a life that's too heavy for one person to carry." He reached out a hand, not toward her scarred skin, but toward her spirit. "I won't promise you an easy life, Clara, but I will promise you a seat at my table. Will you try with me?" The storekeeper paused, his pen hovering over the inkwell. The room felt as though it were holding its breath. Clara looked at the dark, cold night waiting outside the door, and then back at the man who saw her not as a disappointment, but as a partner.
Clara didn't answer with words. She couldn't. Her throat was tight with a mixture of terror and a strange, flickering hope. Instead, she reached out and touched the sleeve of Gideon's heavy canvas coat. It was a silent pact. Gideon nodded once, a sharp and decisive movement. He picked up her heavy trunk as if it were filled with feathers and carried it toward a small buckboard wagon waiting in the shadows. As they left the flickering lanterns of Bitter Creek behind, the world changed. The town was a collection of straight lines and fences, but the wilderness was something else entirely. In the 1880s, traveling into the high mountains was a calculated risk. A wagon wasn't just a vehicle, it was a lifeline. Gideon's wagon was built narrow, specifically designed to navigate switchbacks. These were the zigzagging paths cut into the mountainside to allow horses to climb steep grades without collapsing from exhaustion. The air grew thin and crisp as they began their ascent. Clara looked up at the sky, which felt vast enough to swallow her whole. Gideon kept his eyes fixed on the horizon. Out here, survival meant being a constant student of the atmosphere. "Watch the clouds, Clara," Gideon said, his voice cutting through the rhythmic creak of the wooden wheels. This was a vital lesson for any pioneer. He pointed toward a bank of high, rippling clouds that looked like the scales of a fish. "We call that a mackerel sky. In these parts, it means the wind is shifting. It's a warning that the weather is turning restless." Educational moments like this were the difference between life and death on the frontier. Knowing how to read the signs allowed a homesteader to prepare the hearth and secure the livestock before a storm hit. They traveled in a heavy, weighted silence. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of the train platform where she had been judged. It was the silence of 2 people who were both accustomed to being alone. Clara watched the way Gideon handled the reins. He didn't snap them or shout. He spoke to the horses in low, rhythmic tones that seemed to calm the very air around them. As the wagon rounded a sharp bend, the path narrowed.
To their left was a wall of solid granite. To their right, a drop-off that disappeared into a black, bottomless abyss. The wheels shifted on the loose scree, sending small stones skittering into the dark. Gideon pulled the brake, and the wagon groaned to a halt. He looked at Clara, his face partially shadowed by the brim of his hat. "Beyond this turn is the ridge," he said softly. "It's a world away from everything you've ever known. Once we cross, there's no easy way back. Are you sure, Clara?"
Clara took a long, steadying breath. The air this high was thin and tasted of frost and ancient stone. She looked at Gideon's steady hands on the reins and then back at the dark trail they had climbed. There was nothing left for her down there but a train ticket to a life of shame. She turned her gaze forward. "I'm sure," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. Gideon released the brake and the wagon lurched forward, rounding the final bend. There, nestled in a high mountain meadow surrounded by towering spruce trees, sat the homestead. It wasn't the white picket fence dream Clara had imagined in her letters to Arthur Henderson. It was a rugged, low-slung structure of hand-hewn timber built to withstand the weight of 10-foot snowdrifts. In the 1880s, building a home in the high country was a monumental feat of engineering. These weren't just houses, they were fortresses against the climate. Gideon's cabin was a saddle notch design, where the logs were meticulously notched at the corners to lock together without the need for iron nails, which were expensive and hard to transport. As they stepped inside, the air was cool and smelled of cedar. Clara's eyes traveled to the gaps between the logs. She noticed the chinking, the material used to seal the cabin from the wind. Gideon had used a mixture of dried moss, clay, and straw. This was a vital skill for any mountain man. Without proper chinking, the howling winter winds would strip the heat from a hearth in minutes. Gideon set her trunk down on the dirt floor. The cabin was sparse. There was a heavy trestle table, a single chair, and a fieldstone fireplace that took up half of the far wall. It was a shell of a life, functional but hollow. There were no curtains at the windows, no rug on the floor, and no signs of a woman's touch. Gideon stood by the door, looking uncharacteristically awkward. He pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "I've spent 3 years building these walls, Clara. I know how to keep the rain out. I know how to stack wood for a 6-month freeze. But I realized I don't know how to make it a home. I don't know the first thing about making a place feel like somewhere a person wants to stay." Clara walked to the center of the room. She reached out with her scarred hand and touched the rough bark of the interior logs. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to hide it. The cabin was like her, unpolished, marked by the world, but standing tall. She turned back to him. "A home isn't built of wood, Gideon. It's built of what happens inside it." She looked at the cold, empty hearth. The sun had fully set now, and the mountain silence was absolute. It was a silence that could heal a soul or break it.
The first morning on the ridge didn't arrive with the song of birds, but with the sharp, clean scent of frost and the steady rhythm of an axe hitting wood. Clara woke beneath a heavy buffalo robe, the chill of the cabin biting at her nose. She didn't wait for Gideon to call her. She rose, pinned her hair back, and stepped out into a world of gold and granite. In the 1880s, a homestead was a living machine, and autumn was the most dangerous season. It was the time of the great harvest. For Clara and Gideon, survival depended on how well they could trick time, preserving the bounty of the earth to last through the 6 months of white silence that was coming. Gideon was already at the edge of the meadow, clearing a space for a root cellar. "The earth is the only thing that stays warm when the sky turns to ice," he explained as Clara joined him. An educational element. A root cellar was a frontier necessity. By digging deep below the frost line, usually about 6 feet, settlers could maintain a constant temperature of around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This acted as a natural refrigerator.
They would pack carrots and potatoes in crates of dry sand to keep them from shriveling, and hang dried herbs like sage and yarrow from the ceiling to keep the air fresh and provide medicine during the winter. Clara didn't just watch. She knelt in the dirt, using her good hand to clear stones and her scarred hand to steady the crates. At first, she felt Gideon's eyes on her. She braced for the look of pity she had seen so often in the East. But when she looked up, Gideon wasn't looking at the scars. He was looking at the way she balanced the weight, the way her mind seemed to calculate the space they needed for their winter stores. "You have a steady way about you, Clara," he said quietly. "Most folks rush and break things. You look before you leap." For the first time in years, Clara didn't pull her sleeve down. She felt the sun on her skin and the grit of the mountain soil under her nails. They spent the day in a dance of labor. She taught him the chemistry of the East, how to use wood ash and animal fats to create a soft soap that wouldn't strip the skin, and how to dry wild berries so they wouldn't mold. As the sun began to sink, painting the peaks in shades of violet and bruised orange, the cellar was nearly finished. They stood together, two people the world had discarded, looking at the hole in the earth they had dug with their own 4 hands. "We're going to make it," Gideon whispered, more to himself than to her. But as he spoke, a sudden, biting wind swept down from the high peaks, carrying the unmistakable scent of ice. The warning had been given.
The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It came down from the peaks like a physical weight, rattling the heavy timber door of the cabin. On the frontier, they called this a blue norther, a fast-moving cold front that could drop the temperature 40 degrees in a matter of minutes. For Clara and Gideon, it was the sound of the world closing in. Inside the cabin, the air turned bitter. Gideon had been feeding the hearth, but instead of the smoke rising up the stone chimney, it began to billow back into the room. The cabin filled with a gray, stinging haze that made their eyes water and their lungs burn. "The flue is choked," Gideon coughed, shielding his face with his sleeve. "The pressure from the wind is pushing the smoke down. If we can't get it to draw, we'll have to douse the fire. And without the fire, this cabin will be an icebox by midnight." In the 1880s, the physics of a stone fireplace were a homesteader's best friend or worst enemy. A chimney worked on the principle of thermal draft, hot air rising and creating a vacuum that pulled smoke upward. But in a high mountain storm, the wind could create a downdraft, effectively sealing the chimney with a cap of cold air. Gideon moved toward the door, intending to climb onto the roof in the middle of a gale. But Clara stepped forward, her eyes squinting through the smoke. She noticed something Gideon, in his haste, had missed. She pointed toward the base of the hearth, where a small, jagged crack had formed in the chinking between the stones. "It's not just the wind, Gideon," she said, her voice calm despite the stinging air. "The crack is letting cold air in at the bottom. It's breaking the vacuum. We don't need the roof. We need to seal the base." This was the educational value of a partner. While Gideon provided the muscle, Clara provided the observation. They worked together in the dim, smoky light. Clara grabbed the remaining bucket of wet clay they had used for the root cellar. Using her scarred hand, the one she had been told was useless, she pressed the thick, cold mud into the heated stone. The heat from the rocks dried the clay almost instantly, sealing the leak. Slowly, the gray haze began to swirl, then pull, and finally it was sucked upward with a triumphant whoosh. The fire roared to life, turning from a smoldering mess into a bright golden heart for the home. Gideon slumped against the wall, his face streaked with soot. He looked at Clara, then at her muddy, scarred hand. He didn't say thank you. Instead, he walked over, took a clean cloth, and gently began to wipe the dirt from her skin. The silence between them was no longer about survival. It was about something deeper. But as the fire grew, the sound outside changed. The wind stopped screaming. It became a heavy, muffled thud. Clara moved to the window and wiped the frost away. The world had vanished.
The snow was falling so thick they couldn't see the trees 10 feet away. They were officially cut off from the rest of the world.
The world outside the cabin had vanished into a sea of white. In the high country, a storm like this didn't just bring cold, it brought a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. They were snowed in. In the late 1800s, this was a test of the mind as much as the body. Settlers often spoke of cabin fever, a restlessness born from the crushing isolation and the dim, flickering light of a single hearth. To combat the darkness, they had to be careful with their resources. Kerosene was expensive and hard to haul up a mountain, so many families relied on tallow candles made from rendered animal fat. These candles burned dim and smelled of the kitchen, but they were the only thing keeping the sundown shadows at bay. Gideon sat on the hearth, his large frame casting a long, dancing shadow against the timber walls. He wasn't looking at the fire. He was looking at his own hands, calloused, scarred, and stained with the work of the ridge. "I didn't always belong to the mountains, Clara," he said, suddenly. His voice was so quiet it was almost swallowed by the crackle of the cedar logs. "Back in Missouri, my father was a man of the law. He expected me to be a man of iron, but I was quiet. I liked the way wood felt under a chisel more than I liked the way a fist felt in a fight." He looked up at her, his eyes reflecting the amber embers. "The town saw me as weak. They saw a man who didn't want to conquer the world as a man who had no place in it. I came to this ridge because the trees don't ask you to be anything but what you are." Clara sat across from him, her heart aching with a sudden sharp recognition. She had been rejected because she was broken, and he had been rejected because he was gentle. The world below had no room for either of them. "They told me I was a mistake, Gideon," Clara whispered. She held out her scarred hand, letting the firelight trace the lines of the loom accident. "They told me my value ended when I could no longer work the machines." Gideon leaned forward. He didn't pull away. He reached out and for the first time took her hand in his. His skin was rough like sandstone, but his grip was incredibly light. "The ridge doesn't see a mistake, Clara. It sees a woman who survived a machine and a journey of 1,000 miles. It sees a partner." In that moment, the ghost of memory that had haunted them both, the feeling of being unwanted, began to fade. They weren't two strangers hiding from a storm anymore. They were two architects building something far stronger than a cabin. But as the warmth grew between them, a sharp, rhythmic thudding began to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't the wind. It was a frantic, heavy pounding on the door. The pounding on the door wasn't the sound of a visitor. It was the sound of a crisis. Gideon threw back the heavy bolt, and a wall of freezing white powder collapsed into the room. With it came a young boy, barely 12, his face the color of the very snow that clung to his coat. It was the son of a neighboring homesteader from 3 miles down the pass. "It's my father," the boy gasped, his breath coming in ragged plumes. "The roof on the lean-to gave way under the drifts. He's pinned, and my mother can't move the timber." In the 1880s, neighbor was a sacred word. In the high country, you didn't need to like a man to save his life. You did it because the law of the mountains demanded it. But the storm was still a swirling vortex. To go out now was to risk whiteout disorientation, a phenomenon where the sky and ground become indistinguishable, leading travelers to walk in circles until they succumb to exhaustion. "I have to go," Gideon said, reaching for his heavy wool coat. "Not alone," Clara countered. She was already wrapping her feet in extra layers of burlap and wool, a frontier trick to prevent frostbite by creating pockets of insulating air. Before the invention of modern synthetic fibers, settlers relied on layering. They understood that 2 thin layers of wool were warmer than 1 thick one because they trapped dead air, which acted as a natural thermal barrier.
To navigate a whiteout, Gideon grabbed a long coil of hemp rope. They would tie themselves together, a human chain, so that if one stumbled into a hidden ravine, the other could act as an anchor. They stepped out into a world that had no horizon. The wind tried to steal their breath, but Clara held the rope tight. They used a star navigation method, not with the sky, which was hidden, but by tracking the lean of the trees. On the ridge, the prevailing winds caused the spruce to grow with a slight permanent tilt toward the east. It was a natural compass for those who knew how to read it. They reached the neighbor's cabin by the grace of grit and memory. Gideon used a lever and fulcrum technique, a basic principle of physics, using a long fallen branch and a sturdy rock to multiply his strength and lift the heavy roof beam off the trapped man. Clara didn't stand back. She used her knowledge of the apothecary to stabilize the neighbor. She used a poultice made from warmed flour and mustard seed to draw heat back into the man's chilled limbs, preventing the onset of deep tissue freezing. Her useless hand worked with precision, tying bandages and checking pulses. As they huddled in the neighbor's small cabin, waiting for the worst of the gusts to pass, the neighbor's wife looked at Clara. She didn't see the woman from the train platform. She saw a savior. And in Gideon's eyes, Clara saw something even more profound, a pride that reached deeper than any words of love.
The long, hard winter finally broke. One morning, the air softened, and the sun, instead of being a cold, distant eye, felt warm and inviting. Rivulets of snowmelt began to trickle down the mountain, singing a soft melody of new life. The ridge shed its cloak of white, revealing patches of emerald moss and the tiny persistent blooms of crocus flowers pushing through the thawing earth. Clara stood on the porch, her hands no longer hidden but open to the morning sun. Her scarred right hand now looked less like a mark of damage and more like a map of resilience. The cabin, once a cold comfort, now truly felt like home. The windows had simple muslin curtains dyed with wild berries, and the hearth held the constant comforting scent of cedar smoke. In the 1880s, the arrival of spring on a homestead was a celebration of survival. It meant the arduous work of winter was over and the promise of a new growing season had begun. Educational element. This was the time for sugarin, tapping maple trees to collect sap, which was then boiled down to make syrup, a precious commodity in a land where refined sugar was a luxury. As Clara watched Gideon mend a fence post, their neighbor, Mr. Harrison, approached, his arm still bandaged but his step strong. He wasn't alone. A few townspeople who had ventured up the thawing pass for trade were with him. Arthur Henderson was among them, his gaze cold and calculating as ever. But this time, the whispers were different. Mr. Harrison clapped Gideon on the shoulder. "Your woman, Gideon," he said, his voice full of respect. "She's got more sense than any doctor I've met." Arthur Henderson's eyes found Clara. He saw her not as the plain and damaged woman he had rejected, but as a woman transformed. She stood taller, her gaze steady, her spirit radiating the strength of the mountain itself. The scars on her hand were no longer a deficit, they were a testament to the life she had claimed. Arthur's face was a mask of regret, a silent admission of his grievous error. Clara simply smiled. She didn't need his approval. She had something far more precious. Later that evening, as the last light bled from the sky, Clara and Gideon sat on the cabin porch. The cool air smelled of pine and damp earth. A lone owl hooted in the distance. Gideon reached for her hand, his thumb gently tracing the lines of her scars. "You found your home, Clara," he said, his voice husky. "We found our home, Gideon," she corrected, leaning her head against his shoulder. They were no longer two unwanted souls trying to make do. They were a family forged in the crucible of the wild, and on the ridge they had finally found where they belonged.
And so, the story of Clara and Gideon, the unwanted bride and the quiet mountain man, finds its peace on the ridge. It's a testament to the power of resilience, the strength found in unexpected partnerships, and the quiet dignity of a second chance. If this tale of love, redemption, and survival in the Old West resonated with you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs a little hope, and most importantly, subscribe to Rescued by the Ridge to join our growing family of story lovers. What was your favorite moment in Clara and Gideon's journey? Let me know in the comments below. And be sure to check our playlist for more authentic tales of the frontier. Until next time, may your path be clear and your heart be full.